Okay, so in this lesson, essentially what we're going to do is put it all together. So we've got demand and supply in the market, which is our primary topic here. So far we've looked at demand, we looked at supply separately. Now we're going to look at them together and see what actually happens when those two opposing forces interact within the market. Okay, so let's talk about market equilibrium. So the market consists of both supply and demand. Supply being a behavior of producers, demand being a behavior of consumers. And supply and demand work against each other in the market to establish equilibrium. So they're opposing forces. Because if you take price as the common denominator between the two, what we see, of course, is that for suppliers, when prices increase, suppliers will put more in the market. But consumers, on the other hand, will actually buy less. So equilibrium is the point at which market demand and market supply intersect. So if we look at this, we take demand, we take supply. What we notice, of course, is the two lines cross. And what we'll do here is we'll say, okay, price is $2.99, the quantity is 5.5. So that is our market equilibrium at a price of $2.99 and a quantity of 5.5. Okay, so at that equilibrium price, this graph is a little different. I changed the colors here. It's just a slight change, of course, in the price from the one we just saw and the other one, the quantity. But to give you the idea, when we threw up beef up here, just so we can get a better look at an actual example. So the price is $3. So the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied at the equilibrium price. So at that price of $3, what we see is that the demand, the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied are equal to each other. In other words, every single good that is produced is going to be purchased at that price point. Okay, now when we draw the line down, we look at the quantity here of 6. So this leads to the equilibrium quantity, which is the quantity bought and sold. So at $3, suppliers are going to put 3 in the market, consumers will purchase 3. So in that way, and this is the key point here, every single thing that is created is also purchased. So there's no waste within the market. Now, whenever anything happens in the market, remember those determinants of demand and those determinants of supply, which shift supply and demand to the left and right. Whenever that happens, the market is always going to move towards equilibrium. Now, it may take some time, but what we see, of course, is that the markets is always going to move back towards that equilibrium. It's just a natural thing that happens because of the actions of buyers and sellers force it towards equilibrium. And that's kind of what we're going to focus on with this lesson, is looking at how what buyers and sellers do, moving this market always back towards equilibrium. Okay, so the actions of buyers and sellers move the market towards equilibrium. What we call that are market forces, and we have this law of market forces. So when there's a shortage of a good, the price increases. And when there's a surplus, the price falls. So to help you think about this, if a good is rare, if there's not a lot of it in the market, then the value of the good goes up. If there's a tremendous amount of a good in the market, then the value goes down and the price falls. You can think about this really easy, particularly if you like to shop for clothes, because whenever you go to the store at the end of a season, for example, if you go at the end of the season when they're putting fall clothes out and getting rid of the summer clothes, what you'll notice, of course, is the summer clothes are on sale. Well, that's because they have a surplus of them. So the price falls. If, for example, that we had a very, very harsh winter this year, what we might see is an increase in the price of, say, salt in the area because of the high demand for it in order to clear the roadways. So that helps us on this shortage and surplus. Now, what we want to do, of course, is get a little more detailed in our definitions. So a shortage is when quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, whereas a surplus is when quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. So let's bring this graph back up here and walk through this and look at it. So let's say, for example, that our price is $2. Okay, so we're just going to make something up. Let's say that the price is $2. So let's draw a line across here, this $2 mark. Okay, now where it crosses supply, you'll notice that supply, the quantity for demand, so at $2, consumers are going to demand 8. But suppliers are only going to be willing to produce 4. So you can kind of think about it like this. Remember we said this idea of consumers and also producers being willing and able. So at a price of $2, consumers are willing and able to purchase 8 pounds of beef. However, producers, while able to produce more, are only willing to produce 4 pounds because of the lower price. There's less incentive for them. Now, the difference between the two is the shortage. So the quantity demanded is 8, quantity supplied is 4.1, where I drew the line down. So there's a shortage of 3.9 in the market. Now, based on our law of market forces, what do we know is going to happen? Well, this pretty much tells us when there's a shortage, the price is going to increase. It'll move back towards equilibrium, of course. Now, shortages occur when prices fall below equilibrium. So whenever the price is below the equilibrium price, we're going to have a shortage in the market because that means quantity demand is greater than quantity supplied. Now, if we throw the price up here, and let's say it's $6 is our price, and then our quantity demanded, we draw this line. So let's move up here and look at this. So at this point, if we have a price of $6, quantity supplied increases to 8.5, okay? And our quantity demanded drops. It falls down to like 2.5. So here we have our lines, the difference between the two. So when price increases, supply increases, quantity demanded decreases. And here's the difference between the two. So quantity supplied is 8.5, quantity demanded is 2.5, and we end up with a surplus of 6. So what's that tell us? It tells us that surpluses occur when prices rise above equilibrium. So when supply or demand shift, and creating a new equilibrium and moving into the equilibrium, you can remember that if the price falls below what was the original equilibrium, we're going to see a shortage. And if prices rise above the original equilibrium, then we're going to see a surplus. Okay, so what we did so far is we looked at supply and demand in the market, and we looked at equilibrium, and we looked at how surpluses and shortages are created. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to step in here and take a really detailed look at what happens when we see a shift in supply and demand. So here we have our demand curve, and we'll just call this demand 1, and we have our supply curve, and we'll call this supply. Now what we're going to look at is a shift in demand. So here's our original equilibrium. This is the market equilibrium. Notice that we have our market equilibrium at about $3.99 for a price and about $5 for the quantity in thousands. So we have a price of about $3,900 and we have a quantity here in thousands of about 5,000. So that's our market equilibrium. Now we see equilibrium price and we see equilibrium quantity. So at this point in the market, everything bought is going to be everything that's sold. So we have 100% efficiency. Now, here's what's happening. Suppose that we see a rightward shift in demand. Now, we could say, of course, that maybe consumer income's increased, or maybe the price of a substitute good increased. Remember those determinants of demand. What we've seen, though, is that now demand has shifted from demand 1 to demand 2. As a result, we have a new market equilibrium. Now, whether this is a shortage or a surplus, what's happened? Price rose above equilibrium when demand shifted. You'll notice price rose above. So look here, when we look at our gaps, what we see is a shortage in the market. There's a new equilibrium, demand increased. Okay, so we see that demand increased from 5 to 7. So when demand shifts to the right, the result is a shortage in the market. So demand increased. Now, what's going to happen to the price of the good? Well, it increases. So we see here, this is due to the fact that there's a time lag as producers must adjust to changes in the market. So here's the deal. Demand shifted to the right, so demand increased. As a result, producers must change and increase their production. Well, they can't do it overnight. It takes time. So while producers change and increase their production, they have to adjust to the change in demand. We see a shortage in the market, which causes price to increase. And the reason, of course, price increases is because there's a shortage of the good. There's not enough of it in the market. So producers will increase production as prices rise to become the new equilibrium. So over time, eventually, it's going to take a little bit, the new equilibrium will become the place where we see 100% efficiency. Once producers are able to meet consumer demand at that equilibrium, well, then the market is back in balance. So This means that a shift in demand to the left causes a surplus to occur in the market as quantity demanded for the good falls and suppliers must reduce production to meet new equilibrium. So let's look at that. So here's our original equilibrium. Now, when demand shifts to the left, let's say that consumer incomes fail, or maybe the price of one of the competitive goods, its substitutes, fail. Notice now the new equilibrium has fallen below the original equilibrium. So it's dropped. See, now it's just over 2,000 and basically about 3,800 in terms of quantity. So we have that difference between the two here. Well, that difference now becomes a surplus. And the reason why that difference becomes a surplus is because the producers were producing at 5,000. Now they're producing at about 3,800, 3,900, whatever we want to call that. So all of a sudden now producers have too much on the market and they must reduce production in order to meet this new equilibrium. So make sure you remember that when demand is shifting to the right, up here, we see a shortage. When demand shifts to the left, we see a surplus. Okay, so do not forget that. Demand shifting to the right creates a shortage. Demand shifting to the left creates a surplus. Okay, so on our last slide, we looked at the shift in demand and what that causes. So this time, of course, we'll look at supply. So let's draw our line. So here's our demand curve. Here's our supply curve, supply 1. So here's our original equilibrium. So we'll put in our market equilibriums of about 5,000 on our quantity and about 3,900 on our equilibrium price again. So here we have this. Now, the question, of course, is with what happens with supply. So let's look at this. When supply shifts to the right, notice what happens. We have a fall in the equilibrium. So when we have supply 2 and we have a new equilibrium, notice what's occurred. We have an increase in production. Quantity demanded did not change. The quantity demanded is at 5, but now with this new market equilibrium, supply has increased. So our immediate effect is going to be a surplus on the market. Well, like the law of market forces tells us, whenever we have a surplus, prices will fall. And that's exactly what's going to happen. During that time that we see with our time lag, we're going to see prices fall to meet the new equilibrium to get rid of the excess supplied good. So when something causes a shift in supply to the right, now think about things that cause supply. We might have an increase in technology, which allows us to produce the good cheaper. We could have a decrease in input prices. Maybe one of the substitute goods to our supply here decreased, making this good more of an incentive to produce for our suppliers. Whatever the reason, whenever supply shifts to the right, what we see is the surplus in the market because the price is going to fall. So before price is adjusted, remember the time lag, the quantity demanded reflects the original price, resulting in a surplus until consumer demand adjusts to the new price. And that's kind of one of the things we see with clothes and things of this nature at the end of the season. Essentially, we see a shift in supply. There's too much of the good, and so they reduce prices in order to eliminate that surplus. So that would mean, of course, if supply were to shift to the left, the result then would be a shortage as there's not enough of the production on the market, leading consumers to adjust to the increased price. So we can look at that, of course. When supply shifts out here to the left, we see a decrease in supply. Notice when we say the decrease in supply, what we have, of course, is we see this fall in the quantity supplied, which causes us to have a shortage. And the result, of course, is going to lead to the price increasing from 3,900 to about 5,900. So we see this difference here. So it's important to remember the difference as to what's happening. Supply shifting to the right is going to cause a surplus. Demand shifting to the right causes a shortage. Supply shifting to the left causes a shortage, whereas demand shifting to the left causes a surplus. Okay, next thing we got to think about is what happens if both demand and supply were to shift. So let's throw a demand curve up here. Let's throw our supply curve up. So here's our original equilibrium. Now, let's say, for example, that we have a shift in demand to the right. When that occurs, we see D0 and we see D1. So we know right away when demand shifts to the right, we know we have a shortage in the market because we have an increase in consumer demand, which suppliers must then meet by increasing production, and that's going to cause our prices to rise. Now, when supply shifts, it's shifting in the opposite direction. Now all of a sudden we have a whole different ball game. So here's what you got to understand. So this was the original equilibrium. This is the new equilibrium. Ignore this and ignore this. The reason why is because those are the original supply curves. We want to focus on the new, which is S1 and D1. So look at our new equilibrium and look at our old equilibrium here. So what we see is when supply shifts to the left and demand shifts to the right, we see a significant increase in the price of the good. But we only see a very small increase in quantity supplied. Now, this doesn't always happen, but it's important to understand what would happen if you were to see this. The key point here is remembering which things you need to eliminate. You want to focus on the original D0, S0, and then D1 and S1. So when demand shifts to the right, supply shifts to the left, we have a large increase in price and a very small increase in quantity supplied. So we see here in this outcome, demand shifted to the right, supply shifted to the left. There was a substantial shift in demand, but supply shifted slightly. And so as a result, both equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity rose. So when we see both shifting, what we're going to see is a change in both equilibrium price and quantity. Two things we're going to have a major change in. Okay, so let's look at one more graph on this deal. So let's throw up our demand and supply curves. So here's our original equilibrium, same as we've been dealing with. Now, so demand here shifted to the right. You'll see D0 to D1. Now supply shifted to the left. So here is our new equilibrium right here. So let's mark that. So now we'll notice in this instance, what we see with demand going to the right and supply going to the left. So here's our new equilibrium. So once again, we have an increase in price, which is fairly large compared to the very, very tiny little decrease in quantity. So in this instance, we saw prices increase and we saw quantity demand or quantity decrease for what was taking place in the market based on how things were set up. So in this outcome, demand shifted to the right and supply shifted to the left. However, because the shift in demand was much smaller, the result is different. Equilibrium price rose, but equilibrium quantity fell. So we see this happening. Now, one of the things I'm not going to make you do, of course, is go through looking at both how demand and supply shift. More importantly is what's going to happen when one or the other shifts and the other one stays the same. That's really what you're going to need to focus on, but this does occur. Okay, so on our last slide in this lesson, we're going to look here. It says changes in price and quantity when demand or supply changes. So I put this together for you so that you could look at this and get an idea real quickly of what's going to happen. So we have 8 events based on a change in demand, a change in supply, and then also a change in both. The key point here is to notice when you have a change in just one of them, these first 4 events, notice that it's really easy to see what the effect on price and quantity is. It's very simple: rise, fall, fall, rise. And then the quantity will occur: increase, decrease, increase, decrease. But it gets more difficult when we start to see a change in both. So in events 5 through 8 right here, these involve increases or decreases in both supply and demand. Notice that when this happens, we get this ambiguous idea here between the effect on price and quantity. In other words, if demand increases and supply increases, we can't exactly tell what the effect on price is going to be. We just know that the quantity is going to increase. So you can look through here. The most important thing, of course, is to remember the first 4 events, because you will be expected to understand and be able to tell me what's going to happen, what's the effect on price and quantity in the market when one or the other shifts.